It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Growing Renewable Energy Through Voluntary Markets. My name is Benjamin Simmons and I serve as the head of the Green Growth Knowledge Platform Secretariat. Before we begin today's webinar, I would like to provide a few words of introduction. As many of you know, the Green Growth Knowledge Platform is a global community of organizations and experts committed to collaboratively generating, managing, and sharing green growth knowledge and data. It was originally established a few years ago by the Global Green Growth Institute, the OECD, the United Nations Environment, and the World Bank. And the GGKP is now a global partnership of over 50 leading international organizations, research institutes, and think tanks. We are delighted to be hosting today's webinar with the Center for Resources Solutions. The presentations and discussion today will explore the role of voluntary markets in accelerating the global deployment of renewable energy. Before introducing the moderator for today's event, I'd like to highlight a few logistical issues. First, we strongly encourage participants to raise questions to the speakers throughout the webinar. This can be done by typing your question into the chat box, which can be found on the right-hand side of the webinar dashboard. Your questions will be submitted to our technical staff, who will then repost them to all the participants for our panelists to address during the Q&A period. We will also be circulating a survey after the webinar concludes, and would encourage you to complete it, as this provides us with really very important feedback to help shape our future webinars. This is our 6th webinar for this year, and we've had over 1,000 participants, so we're delighted that this will be the final webinar of 2016. Finally, if you have any technical issues with the webinar, please email us at contact, that's C-O-N-T-A-C-T, at ggkp.org, and we will help you troubleshoot. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's event, Ms. Jahiza Subrati. Jahiza is the head of the policy unit in the Energy, Climate, and Technology branch within UN Environment. Jahiza has close to 20 years of work experience in environment and sustainable development policy and planning, including the associated multilateral processes and extensive field experience. Prior to joining UN Environment, Jahiza worked for 3 years in environmental consulting in the private sector and for 15 years in the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development for Mauritius. Jahiza has a multidisciplinary background with degrees in chemistry and environmental studies, a master's in international trade and economic diplomacy, and a postgraduate degree in solid waste management. Jahiza, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. It is my great pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you for the GGKP to host this webinar and to have invited the United Nations Environment and me to moderate this webinar. Renewable energy markets for the private sector, voluntary markets, have been growing increasingly over the recent years. Today we have a number of speakers who would be explaining to us their own perspectives, how they have felt the market evolve and grow, and the potential this could represent to countries and cities to meet their climate commitments, as well as to meet other sustainable development objectives, multiple development objectives, such as improving equality, generating jobs, and meeting growing electricity demand through diverse methods. So today we will start with a presentation by Jennifer Martin, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Resource Solutions. Jennifer brings over 2 decades of NGO and private sector experience in renewable energy and energy efficiency, as well as in distributed generation, electricity markets, and technology development, and electricity sector and climate change policy and regulation. She is currently a member of REGIS Stakeholder Advisory Committee and served in the past as technical chairperson of the REGIS Operational Rules Committee. Jennifer is also a member of the State Federal RPS Collaborative Advisory Group and serves on the Revolve Board of Directors. She is the author of several reports and papers addressing renewable energy and utility policy and technology assessment, resource planning, risk assessment, and environmental impacts. She has given numerous public presentations and media interviews. Jennifer earned her undergraduate and graduate degrees from Pomona College and Duke University. Jennifer, welcome to this webinar. We will now open the webinar with the first presentation by yourself and followed by interventions by other speakers. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I wanted to also thank the Green Growth Knowledge Platform for hosting this webinar today. Today I'm going to be talking about how voluntary markets, that is markets that allow customers, residential and non-residential customers, to choose renewable energy, can help accelerate the growth of renewables in addition to policy measures. Why are we talking about renewable energy in the first place? As we all know, renewable energy is a powerful tool to combat a number of the world's most pressing problems. Power generation is one of the leading causes of urban air pollution around the world, and the electricity sector is the single largest source of global greenhouse gas emissions. So when we look at renewables, most countries are using a suite of tools to try to accelerate the growth of renewable energy in the electricity sector. There's several common types of tools in use, and lots of countries use several of these at the same time. These range from things like feed-in tariffs and other preferential rates and tariffs, financial incentives such as tax incentives and rebates, carbon regulatory policy, which increases the cost of fossil resources in the electricity grid, and government mandate programs such as quota systems, and as we have here in the United States, a renewable portfolio standard policy. Today we're going to be focusing on another tool in the toolbox to accelerate the growth of renewables, which is the development of voluntary renewable energy markets. Those are markets that allow residential and non-residential customers to choose to buy more renewable energy than they would otherwise receive from their electricity service provider. Why are voluntary markets important? Well, in the places where they've been well developed, they've been a proven and effective complement to policy drivers. They are also a market-based demand driver. As many of you know, many of the world's largest companies already have renewable energy goals that they're pursuing for their global operations, and they're increasing them year on year. And now many of these large companies are starting to push the demand for renewable energy down to their supply chain partners. So the amount of electricity load at stake here is potentially very large. And finally, renewable energy, by engaging the voluntary market participants in the electricity sector, it can accelerate market development and even overcome some market barriers that policy mechanisms may face. The United States has the most mature voluntary renewable energy market, and I wanted to just briefly show this slide to show the impact that it can have. This slide shows the total megawatt hours produced by renewable energy in the United States over the last 10 years or so. And you look at the two middle blue slices. The lighter blue slice shows all the new renewable energy that's been added to the grid as a result of government mandates. And so in the United States, this would be the combination of the various state renewable portfolio standard programs or quota systems. The darker blue line above it shows the contribution that this voluntary market has been able to contribute to the overall mix of new renewables on the grid. And so while it is not as large as what the policy drivers have been able to accomplish, it is a very significant driver of new renewables. And this is something that can be repeated in other places, and we have seen grow in a number of other regions of the world. Just finally, to wrap up on the benefits of having a robust voluntary market, is that it can be a very effective complement to existing policies, and it can expand the market and liquidity for the environmental benefits created by renewables. These markets can also not only accelerate the pace of clean energy development, but can also accelerate the rate at which countries can achieve their emission reduction targets and go beyond those targets. Voluntary markets can also lower regulatory compliance costs for mandatory markets. increase the role of private investment in the market, and help build technical expertise and regulatory expertise that will, in the long run, facilitate even more renewable energy growth. Finally, by promoting voluntary markets, it's incents the private sector in your country or your region to take on a leadership role that they might not otherwise be able to take on, and to engage them in helping reach overall policy targets. So when we talk about voluntary market options, there's really quite a lot of different things that are going on depending on what country you're looking at and how the market is structured. This is a list of the different ways in which companies and homes and apartment owners and dwellers typically are able to engage in voluntary market transactions. They fall into three general categories. One is self-generation, so that would be equipment that the energy user either owns or leases. It could be on-site or off-site. This ranges from small-scale residential solar to really large-scale, grid-scale renewable technologies that are purchased by large commercial or industrial customers. There's also direct purchasing through the form of a renewable power purchase agreement or PPA. These could be on-site or off-site facilities, and they could also be focused on just purchasing the renewable energy attributes, or RECs or GEOs, depending on what market you're in. And then finally, we're seeing the development of new types of direct purchasing that we're lumping into the category called the virtual PPA, which really includes different kinds of financial tools that allow large purchasers, large companies, to lower the financial risk and provide some revenue certainty and capital to new projects while not necessarily needing to take delivery of the electricity as it's produced. And then finally, the third category, which is the most common around the world, are retail purchasing options. This is when consumers are buying renewable energy from a power provider, and depending on the market structure, that could be a utility or a competitive electricity supplier in the market. And also in some markets, customers are able to purchase renewable energy certificates or guarantees of origins, a certificate that represents renewable energy attributes. Just to give you a sense of how this market has developed in the United States, this is a chart showing the types of products that are the most common in the US market. So what's been most interesting to people over time is that top green bar, which represents new commitments by large corporate purchasers to purchase renewable purchase power agreements directly with new renewable generation being put on the grid. There's been tremendous growth in the space just in the last few years, and recently corporate PPAs have been the leading source of new power purchase agreements for renewables in the US, outpacing utility procurement. There are other ways that individuals, consumers and corporations can engage in renewable energy. These include direct investment, purchasing carbon offsets that are sourced from renewable energy facilities, and also direct donations to facilities to help them overcome initial capital cost barriers, for example. We see companies engaging in these strategies around the world, but they do not convey the renewable energy usage claim and the Scope 2 greenhouse gas claim that many large corporations are looking for when they engage in renewable energy. So the rest of the presentation is going to be focused on the list of purchasing options which do convey the renewable energy usage claim to the end consumer. I'd like to step back now and just talk a little bit about how these different renewable energy purchasing options can be implemented in different types of market structures. As you know, the electricity sector is one of the most heavily regulated sectors in any economy, and there's a wide variety of market structures in place around the world, from non-restructured markets, which are typically a vertically integrated utility, often state-owned, with little or no competition even in the development of new renewable energy generation facilities on the grid. And then on the other end, full retail and wholesale deregulation. This is common in much of Europe, parts of the United States, and a few other, handful of places around the world. Most recently, Mexico moving in this direction, where there's not only competition for the generation of power and independent operation of the grid, but access to choice by every consumer on the grid. The market structure in place really determines what type of voluntary options can be encouraged in a market. And I'm just going to run through a couple examples. So if you look at a non-restructured electricity market, so China might be a good example here. There's some experiments going on there with introducing competition in wholesale markets, but for the most part, it's a vertically integrated market with little or no choice for consumers. In these kinds of markets, there's just a handful of choices that could be made available if you want to support the development of voluntary renewable energy markets. Of course, on-site, behind-the-meter self-generation is one. The next two options, direct access tariffs and utility green pricing programs, are two types of programs that utilities can offer to give customers a choice to elect to purchase renewable energy more than would normally be provided. Direct access tariffs are increasingly getting a lot of attention because they provide a lot of the benefits that large corporate customers are looking for from renewable energy procurement, including the ability to purchase electricity over longer time horizons at known prices. And then, of course, there's also the non-electricity market purchasing options I discussed before, such as investment in renewables. And we see this, China's another good example where you see leading companies who don't have the ability to purchase renewable energy on the grid, but instead are investing in the development of renewables so they can at least say that they're helping to support the grid becoming greener where they have operations. On the other end of the scale, in a market where you have full retail and wholesale competition, there's a much wider variety of choices for customers, the complete list that we looked at before. So self-generation is an option, direct purchasing for customers who are large enough to enter into PPAs, and many different retail purchasing options offered by a variety of different types of retail providers. One thing that's catching a lot of attention these days is the development of community renewables programs. These are programs where an electricity provider pools together load, could be residential load, commercial load, or a combination, to buy directly from a new renewable energy installation. And these kinds of programs have been implemented in different ways in different countries, but it's an interesting model for bringing some of the more of the benefits directly to the consumer and also making it accessible to smaller consumers. No matter the type of market structure you have, there's some key issues that policymakers and those involved in developing the market need to pay attention to in order to have a robust market. The first and foremost is preventing double counting. One of the main drivers for engagement by consumers and businesses in voluntary market products is that they want to feel that they're making a difference. For corporate companies, often one of the main drivers is that they need to they want this to contribute to their the global greenhouse gas accounting, and in order to do that, they need to show that the renewable energy purchase that they're making is not being counted towards a regulatory policy or other mandate. The second bullet here, maintaining regulatory surplus and market impact, relates to that. Again, customers and especially corporate buyers are going to have more incentive to engage in the market if they feel that their investments are going to make a difference and it will be able to be attributed to them. Most markets that have developed to some level of maturity introduce energy attribute certificate systems. In the United States, we call these RECs. In Europe, they have GOs. Mexico, they have clean energy certificates or CELs. So there are a number of markets that have these types of certificates. They really add liquidity to the market and also increase confidence in the market because there is one legally established way to track and account for who is using renewable energy. As markets evolve, the number of voluntary options increases. That increases the complexity of the market, so it's important to make sure that the market participants, government, tracking systems, if they're in place, any NGOs involved in supporting the market address some of these more complex issues in a way that is supportive of the market, including tracking systems, and engaging in facilitating the increasing number of transactions and the number of participants. Communicating with customers is important, especially in markets where this is a new idea. Customer education is a key part of getting these markets going. NGOs can often play a supporting role in this, but government can also be very important in helping customers understand what choices mean and where their money goes. As markets develop, there's also increasing financial issues. Sometimes you're getting, advanced markets as in Europe and the US, some products start looking like financial instruments, and so there are regulatory issues that sometimes come up with those instruments and other issues. Now I'm going to just wrap up this section and just repeat again that the core message is that no matter what type of market structure you have, there are options that governments and cities and regions can promote to increase the role of consumers and corporations in engaging in renewable energy, and that the more deregulation present in the market, the more options there are, but also the greater complexity. One of the most important things to remember if you're thinking about trying to promote voluntary markets is that products need to be designed in a way that they're credible to the consumer. Consumers are looking for a number of things when they're engaging in voluntary markets. They want to know that there's real delivery of renewable energy to the grid, that they can have confidence in the products that they're buying, that there's not double counting or double claiming of the same unit of renewable energy, and that the market is in sync with the regulatory structure. As we all know, many organizations, government organizations, are working to create new policies that affect the electricity sector. These can be direct electricity sector policies, also environmental policy, carbon policy, that will affect the benefits and the way that renewable energy markets work. So it's important as the voluntary market grows over time that there's continual attention to how that market is interacting with government policy. There are some key issues that form the foundation of creating credible markets. One is that the source of data for trading renewable energy is credible and reliable. In most places, there's some government role here or the involvement of independent system operator if one exists in the country. Another are that when people buy renewable energy, there's a legal basis for them owning it and being able to claim it as a unique user of that renewable energy generation. Most markets also create geographic and vintage or time-based limitations on the trading of renewable energy so that there's not oversupply in the market and so that claims are credible. When a company wants to say that it's buying renewable energy, that renewable energy generally needs to be generated in relatively close time proximity to when the company is using the electricity and making the claim. There's a number of tools that organizations and countries can look at to help facilitate these markets. Chief among these is making sure that there's a mechanism for documenting ownership and claims. As I've mentioned before, certificates can play a role in this, but the core underlying thing is that there needs to be a legal mechanism by which you can trade and use renewable energy and document sort of ownership claims to use of that renewable energy. It's also helpful to have a mechanism for tracking transactions and ownership. Most markets initially start using contracts for this, and quickly, as markets grow, move to tracking systems because they provide more transparency and a common currency for transactions to occur. Verification and certification of transactions are also important for providing confidence to the market and market participants. I wanted to spend just a minute or two introducing the concept of energy attribute certificates for those who are not familiar with them. In most markets, that are restructured energy attribute certificates, and these can go by different names. In Europe, they're guarantees of origin. We have renewable energy certificates in the US, different names in different countries, but they generally provide the same function, which is to create a certificate for each unit of generation inserted onto the grid, and that certificate becomes the means by which the claim to use of the renewable energy is transferred to end-use consumers. Certificates are useful because they provide a way to access, allocate, and claim use of renewable energy when there's a shared electricity grid. Also prevents double counting because there's only one way to document use of renewable energy. It facilitates consumer choice and allows consumers to create demand-side change. And it creates a broader market for renewable energy because it allows renewable energy generation to be sited where it makes sense based on resource and grid availability, and provides consumers, from the smallest consumers to the very largest corporations, a way to engage in buying renewable energy from generators, even if they are far from them on the same grid. Another important thing that we've seen in most developed markets is the role of third-party certification. My organization, CRS, administers the Green E program, which is active in the United States and Canada right now, and beginning to expand certification to other countries. This is a chart just showing the demand for Green E certification across several different customer types over time in the United States. Green E certifies the majority of voluntary transactions in the United States, and those are across the board for residential customers and large-scale corporate customers. Third-party certification provides an important role because it provides consumer confidence in the market to know that a third party is verifying that you're actually getting what you pay for when you're buying an invisible commodity. It also can help drive the market more quickly by creating standards and rules for the market that might tighten supply in a way to provide more of a demand driver for the development of new renewables. Now I'd like to turn the final part of my presentation to talk about policy drivers for market impact. As I've mentioned already, the policy environment has a very important role in being able to develop a strong voluntary market. Having a complementary regulatory framework is key for voluntary markets to succeed, no matter what type of market structure you have. As I've mentioned, two key things are that the policy environment must support the legal ability to trade and purchase renewable energy. And that's true whether or not you have a vertically integrated utility or complete market deregulation. Another important aspect that needs to be supported by policy is the ability to be able to account for voluntary transactions distinctly. One of the most important drivers of success in the US market has been the fact that the compliance market, or the policy-driven market driven by state renewable portfolio standards, and the voluntary market use the same mechanism for accounting, the renewable energy certificate, so that when a voluntary buyer buys renewable energy, they know with certainty that that same megawatt hour is not being used to meet a policy requirement. This provides certainty to the market that investments in the voluntary market are making a difference. There are quite a few other issues to look at when you're thinking about policy interactions. These include policies in the electricity sector and also in carbon regulation. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there are a wide variety of policies already in place across the world, from quota systems and feed-in tariffs, financial support, and a wide variety of carbon policies that have impacts on the electricity sector and on how voluntary action in the electricity sector has impacts on environmental performance of the country or region. It's possible to create ways in which all of these different types of mechanisms that I've listed here on the slide can interact in a positive way with voluntary markets. It just requires a little thought and planning to make sure that they're working in concert and not at odds with each other. I could give you a quick example with feed-in tariffs. So feed-in tariffs are a very common way that governments use to incent renewable energy by providing long-term contracts to renewable generators to provide electricity to the grid. When a voluntary buyer looks at a feed-in tariff, the question is whether or not the purpose of the feed-in tariff is to provide grid access, or is it to provide renewable energy for the benefit of all grid customers. One issue that comes up and often confuses voluntary markets is if feed-in tariffs are so high that voluntary market transactions can't compete with the feed-in tariff. So right now, this is a situation that's occurring in Japan, where the feed-in tariff level is so high that voluntary buyers can't afford to compete with it when they go to developers to talk about buying new renewables on the grid. The feed-in tariff level is so attractive to developers and so much higher than voluntary buyers can afford to pay that there's not a good enough incentive in the market for voluntary buyers to invest in working on new project development with developers. Different types, this is not always the case. There's other examples where feed-in tariffs and voluntary markets can work side by side, but it's something that you need to pay attention to if you're thinking about trying to create a situation for growth in voluntary markets in your country or region. There's other roles the government will play with voluntary markets, and these generally apply to renewable markets in general, that include access to capital, access to transmission, tariff design. This is especially important for distributed generation, siting and permitting, and resource planning processes. These are things that affect renewables development overall, including for the voluntary market. And I'd like to conclude my comments about the roles in government to focus on what government can do to promote the market. Government can be a purchaser. Many times the government has been the first and largest purchaser when voluntary markets are just starting. This is a key role government can play to, one, demonstrate the validity of the market and also show leadership. Governments can also require the provision of voluntary markets. So particularly in markets that don't have retail deregulation, government can require utilities to offer a voluntary option to customers. And then finally, government can be a promoter of the market by recognizing purchasers and providing market support, including market analysis and information and education, and purchaser recognition. This has been particularly strong and impactful in the United States, where the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has for many years run the Green Power Partnership Program, which recognizes leadership by corporations in using renewable energy. Just as a few concluding remarks, no matter what type of market structure you have in your country or region, it's possible to create options that will attract voluntary market investment. The key thing is to make sure that those options meet the criteria that customers require, including that there's not double counting, that the market is complementary to and not contradicting to the policy environment that you have. I think with that, I'll sum up my presentation so that there's room for more discussion and questions at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for having shared with us such an interesting overview of voluntary markets, why they're important, what are the benefits, growth in the US market and in other emerging countries, as well as the common tools that are at the moment often used by countries and states. We will now move on to the first discussant of this webinar, Jonathan Cooney. Welcome, Jonathan. Jonathan Cooney is the Global Lead for Green Competitiveness at the World Bank Group. He co-leads the World Bank Group's work to support private sector in developing countries to successfully compete in growing climate-related sectors with a focus on innovation. Previously, Jonathan was the program coordinator at the World Bank's Group Climate Technology Program. During his tenure, the program scaled significantly, establishing a network of 7 climate innovation centers and bringing in 5 donor partners. At the bank, Jonathan has also worked in the energy sector. Prior to joining the bank, Jonathan worked at the International Energy Agency, where he led teams to review country energy policies, negotiated with governments on policy recommendations, and published books on energy policy. Jonathan was also a financial consultant to the private power sector for over 7 years, structuring project finance for greenfield IPPs and acquisitions in the United States, Latin America, and Asia. In addition, he developed and marketed a renewable energy cooling technology for the Caribbean market. Jonathan holds an MBA from INSEAD, France, and undergraduate and master's degrees in engineering from Brown University in the States. He has written 10 books on international energy policy and holds 2 US patents in clean energy technology. Jonathan, welcome to the webinar. I hand over now to you as discussant following Jennifer's very interesting presentation.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Jennifer. I would concur that that was a very interesting and informative presentation, raising a lot of information and then some questions. I wanted to focus my comments in 2 categories. One is how to adapt and apply the experiences and the structures you're talking about to developing country contexts, and then how the voluntary market for renewables could or could not be tweaked to ensure that it's supporting local private sector development to build and install those renewables with a focus on innovation for continual improvement. So the first set of categories on developing countries, in a way, it's a bit of a dispiriting picture based on what you described there. You know, there's no carbon tax to speak of in the developing countries, no RECs or portfolio standards or quotas. A large driver for renewable installations of the international carbon markets have decreased substantially. And just let me make clear, when I talk about developing countries, it's a bit of a useless term because it encompasses a whole bunch of countries, but let me sort of take my arguments to the extreme and talk about some of the lesser developed countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which are lesser developed economy-wise, and then also in terms of energy spread. The electricity access rates are 25% or so. So you have this lack of support for renewables, and then you had a list there, Jennifer, things that voluntary markets need, and there's not a lot of them that would be found in most of the countries that I'm talking about in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's a little dispiriting. Now the good news is that the competition for against renewables is lousy in the sense there's only 25% electrification rate, more or less, and then the provisions through the grid is unreliable. You have less incumbency fighting against these new entrants of renewables, both in terms of companies that would fight it, although you do have a utility that has ambivalence towards it, but you have less infrastructure incumbency, if you will. That is to say, you're not fighting against an established grid. Another problem that you're going to have in developing countries is there's going to be less of a willingness to pay a green premium, which seems, you know, based on your talk and what we all know about voluntary markets in the OECD countries, is driving a lot of this. So given that the regulatory structure is not quite up to par to what you're talking about, but that there's a lot of factors that are driving the growth of renewables vis-a-vis competition from the fossil fuel side, what lessons or structures can be drawn from the more developed countries to apply to these developing countries? With, again, my focus is primarily sub-Saharan Africa, the countries that sort of need the help the most. Because in the absence of a strong regulatory structure to drive renewable installation, you could say it all becomes voluntary. It all becomes voluntary, but you don't want to leave it at that and say, okay, well, good luck with that. You can certainly beat the fossil fuel-driven state-owned utility. What can be drawn from the voluntary markets to serve, the more industrialized country markets to serve effectively in the developing countries? And of course, there's an example of this is already happening if you consider off-grid renewables voluntary, and they are in the absence of a regulatory driver. What can be done more to encourage either off-grid renewables to increase their deployment, or to sort of look for the next off-grid renewable, that is to say, going beyond a solar system. So I think it's an interesting idea to take the lessons here, but it doesn't translate without some kind of tweaking or adaptation. The second point about that I wanted to make on the voluntary renewable markets is, can they be effective tools to support local private industry in the renewable sector in a way that also stimulates rather than stymies innovation? If you talk to businesses, they all complain, oh my God, we can't go into this new sector because we don't have enough certainty. We want either a quota system, renewable portfolio standard, we're going to get, X% in the next 10 years or so, a feed-in tariff, which is a huge amount of certainty on the price side, or something like a PPA, of course, which gives certainty on the price side and on the off-taker side. Now, you don't have any of that with the voluntary markets. Now, one way to handle that is just, one response to the industry is just tough. Why would you think that if you go into a new market, you would have all this certainty on price and or sales dictated by government mandate? Other sectors don't have that. If you're building laptops, you don't have that, so you say tough. However, given that this is a newish sector, it might be interesting to see whether the voluntary market could nonetheless have some attributes to it, or could be designed in such a way to encourage private industry to get involved, and then also to have them drive innovation. One of the things we're looking at here at the World Bank is results-based financing. So what you would do is not really get involved into the kind of regulatory structures and tools that you articulated and explained, due to the fact that it's quite complicated to do, and you're talking about markets that have a lot of problems, and getting a proper regulatory structure that encourages voluntary renewable energy may not be the top priority. But nonetheless, we want to have this happen. So putting, call it an incentive, call it a subsidy, although we wouldn't use that term, if a certain renewable technology is put into place in the field, is deployed in the field, a certain compensation would come from a pool of money provided by the donors through the World Bank that would compensate various actors in that process. And ultimately, the money would flow back, or some portion of it would flow back to the private sector players, either the manufacturers or the private sector developers in country that sold at the retail level. And then one way you can tweak that results-based financing system to have it maybe only local companies are eligible for certain parts of the supply chain, and then you get a local market, which is very important for many, many reasons. And you can, in addition, also say, well, we will only provide this results-based financing for technologies that meet certain criteria, certain efficiency criteria, for example. If you're looking at cook stoves, which is another major issue in developing countries, of course, only ones that meet certain criteria on the health benefits. I'm talking about renewable energy, but the same could very much apply to cook stoves that have a certain amount of efficiency, or use briquettes rather than using firewood, which has advantages in terms of overall efficiency on the life cycle side. So I'll stop there and let others comment. I don't know if Jennifer, you wanted, how we're going to run this, if you wanted to get back to me, or we're going to open to questions. I know we have another discussant, but thanks again, very, very informative. And in general, I'd be interested to see how discussion goes on applying this to developing countries, and then also making sure the voluntary market mechanisms can nonetheless be a tool to support local private sector with a drive towards innovation.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Very interesting points complementing Jennifer's previous presentation with insight into how this needs to be adapted to developing countries and how that could be also made more interesting and applicable to private sector in developing countries to embark into voluntary markets. We will proceed with this next discussant and then take questions and reactions from the audience. So we now move to our second discussant for this webinar, Jeremy Tamanini. Jeremy is the founder at Dual Citizen LLC, a Washington, D.C. based consultancy. Dual Citizen works with governments, international organizations, and private firms on leveraging data analytics and strategic communications to advance their growth and development agendas. To support this work, Dual Citizen produces two analytic products. The first is the Global Green Economy Index, a biennial assessment of how 80 countries and 50 cities perform in the global green economy, as well as how expert practitioners judge this performance. The fifth edition references 22 underlying indicators across the four main dimensions of leadership in climate change, efficiency sectors, markets and investment, and the environment. The second, in partnership with Knowledge SRL, is a systems analysis of the largest national carbon emitters and how their energy markets, investment and employment patterns will evolve as they progress towards emission reduction targets defined in the recent COP21 in Paris. More information on this work is available on their website, including links to country profiles for the United States and China. Jeremy started his career in the private sector at an internet startup and then as director of marketing at Armani Group. His passion for global policy and development issues led to a Fulbright Fellowship in the United Arab Emirates. His research there explored the interaction of place branding and economic development in Dubai through engaging with local government officials while based in Dubai Media City. Jeremy founded Dual Citizen in 2010 with a vision for applying the tools and tactics gained from his private sector experience to global issues, with particular focus on green economy and sustainable development. He has worked with international organizations including the World Bank and the Global Green Growth Institute, government agencies in the US, academic institutions, and national governments. His paper, Do National Green Reputations Matter? The Global Green Economy Index, and Implications for Stakeholders in the Green Economy, was published in the International Place Branding Yearbook. His 2013 white paper, Communications and Green Economic Growth, can also be found on the website. Jeremy is a graduate with distinction from Georgetown's School of Foreign Service with a master's degree in foreign policy and honors certificate in international business diplomacy. He holds a bachelor's degrees in urban studies and economics from Columbia University. So welcome, Jeremy, to this webinar. We have just listened to Jennifer's very interesting presentation and some quite interesting remarks from Jonathan on particular applications of voluntary markets. Would be very interested to hear from you about your own perspective of how voluntary markets are responding to clean energy requirements by consumers, including large commercial consumers. So over to you, Jeremy.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the GGKP for inviting me today. As has already been described, we take a pretty data-centric perspective on working in the realms of green economy and green growth. This is through the Global Green Economy Index, which is a ranking of how countries perform in the Global Green Economy Index, including around issues related to renewable energy and the policies that support it, as well as a newer product where we look at projections and modeling on how the Paris Climate Agreement and the national INDCs and emission reduction targets will potentially reshape energy markets in some of the largest emitters like China and the United States. And the output from those efforts can be accessed on the GGKP web portal. So I will keep my comments brief today, so we have time for questions. But given kind of our focus, my comments and reactions to the very interesting presentation from Jennifer are mostly through the lens of data and the lens of how data analytics can be perhaps leveraged from these voluntary markets to further growth overall in the renewable energy sector. And my first reaction actually is related to a video that can be accessed on the Center for Resource Solutions website. It's from a webinar that was given there titled Introduction to Renewable Energy Tracking Systems. This was a fascinating webinar for me because what it showed was how data on these renewable energy certificates in North America has actually been collected quite methodically. This is important, as Jennifer pointed out, related to transparency and verification, certainty, if you will, around renewable energy generation. So what's interesting about many of these tracking systems is that they provide a lot of historic data, such as the fuel source, the vintage, so the year when the renewable energy was generated, the location, so where it was within a geographic area. And if I recall correctly, there are 6 or 7 different sort of regional tracking systems in North America, including the US and Canada, as well as some information on emissions, although that's not as big of a part of the tracking. And where this led me in terms of data analytics and renewable energy more broadly is that in the residential space now in the United States, there's a lot of effort to integrate data analytics to improve efficiency. So for example, retailers that are trying to sell panels on the residential level are finding that the market's a bit tapped out of the early adopters, if you will, people that are maybe less price sensitive and more enthusiastic about solar energy. And so what they're challenged by is trying to figure out, okay, how do we target new prospective customers in an efficient manner? How do we use data analytics to predict in a way which type of residential customers who currently don't have distributed, rooftop solar, which ones might be more open or amenable to the offering than others? And to me, it seemed as though perhaps this historic data on the voluntary market, to the extent that it exists in these different regions of the country, could be useful to those companies. It could perhaps provide some indications around what type of customers who have already expressed interest in voluntary markets maybe are more likely to want to develop a distributed, residential solar system for the future. So that was one example where, to me, it seemed like data analytics had power kind of beyond maybe where it's already been being used. And this could perhaps apply in the commercial space as well, where it seems like there's been more traction thus far with renewable energy certificates. It could be that, again, looking at the commercial entities that have already bought these certificates, these may be riper targets, if you will, for PPAs or a more evolved commitment to renewable energy. And as Jennifer pointed out, this PPA space in the United States is rapidly growing. Companies in a lot of areas are really the movers and shakers in terms of new renewable installations. So I think maybe linking some of the voluntary data to propel those commercial markets further could be interesting. My last second comment is kind of more about the communication side of this, and I think this relates to some of Jonathan's comments as well about the developing world. And, my comments are sort of a more US-centric view, I realize, and there are different challenges perhaps that this concept would face in different market contexts. Starting though with the US, I think my opinion, just interacting superficially with RECs and utilities and how this is messaged, is that it's somewhat dense. I question if on the customer level, so down to residential customers, there's enough clarity and value proposition here beyond someone that has a real interest in going above and beyond to consume renewable energy. It seems like if you Google, for example, buy, renewable energy certificate in some of these bigger markets, a lot of the information that comes up is more academic or analytical. It's less linked to calls to action for the customer and how they can actually access it. And we find in a lot of our surveying related to renewable energy that there's constantly a gap between customer desires and customer ability around renewable energy. You have a lot of pent-up demand, I believe, on the consumption side, but a lot of people just, they're not ready to front the upfront cost for distributed solar in their own home. And this seems to me like a perfect kind of entry point, but I wonder if the access and the messaging is clear and simple enough to really broaden out the volumes of residential customers that can absorb and sign up for this. Other ideas related to that are just, NGOs or government, probably NGOs, maybe being more strategically linked to the utilities and their own communications to customers, where this voluntary option could be marketed and highlighted perhaps in a way that slowly led to more consumer understanding of what's going on. And obviously, this idea in the developing world, I think, needs to be treated very carefully. Jonathan already mentioned the price sensitivity, which is a huge issue. But beyond that, just the idea of transparency and legitimacy, I think would be extremely important to think about if there are developing countries that are thinking about rolling out this concept. But in summary, for the second point, it feels to me, even in the US market, there may be opportunities for more aggressive and slightly simpler customer communication around the ways to engage in the voluntary market. And obviously I'd love to hear Jennifer's feedback on that, given she's much more familiar with efforts to promote voluntary markets. So on that, I will conclude and pass the podium back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for complementing the perspective of the previous two speakers on this topic. We will now start addressing questions and comments from the speaker audience. Waiting for the administrator to transfer those to us. Okay, so first question addressed possibly to Jennifer first, and then to our other two discussants if they wish to add anything. So Jennifer, how do we increase the competitiveness of renewable energy prices and reduce the price for the end user in your own experience?
Well, I'd like to say, you know, when we look at the development of these kind of markets and options, you have, especially if you're talking about a country that doesn't have them yet, you need to take a long view. This is something that took over 20 years to develop in the United States. And so if you're looking at a developing country that doesn't have any of this in place yet, you need to look at a longer term view, just like you would with any other policy development. Pricing is a key thing, and I'd say that's one of the main reasons why we've seen this tremendous increase in the interest from the corporate sector in renewable energy. In many economies, renewable energy is actually becoming the least cost source of new electricity. The big driver for the growth in the corporate power purchase agreements with renewables in the United States has been that a long-term power purchase agreement with a new wind generator is actually less expensive than any other type of power you could buy on the grid right now. That's not true in every economy, especially in countries where there's heavy subsidization in the electricity sector. So I'd say a big caveat is that this is a market-based mechanism, and if you're wanting to grow this in a market system that has a lot of subsidies in the electricity sector, it's much harder to attract people based on price. That said, I think most of the market growth we've seen in the US and in Europe has been from customers and companies who've been doing it, not because they're doing it to save money, but because it's part of, you know, their vision for their company. They've made sustainability goals. They're trying to reduce the footprint of their home or of their business, and it's been a major driver of most of the growth in the market we've seen so far. I think in some economies that's going to be switching now to being a cost driver. So some of the questions Jonathan was asking about developing country context, the concepts I'm talking about work best when you've got, you know, an integrated grid, and so sort of off-grid applications. I think the barriers and issues are a little bit different, and these tools wouldn't necessarily address the questions, some of those questions you were bringing up. But if you look at, you know, say more urban areas in developing countries where you do have an integrated grid, companies, you know, Fortune 100 companies around the world are already doing business in these places and asking their utilities to provide them with green power options. We've seen this across a number of Asian countries, in India, in Latin America. So in a lot of places there's interest, and there's an electricity sector that is in a structure where you could certainly move forward with these kinds of options.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jonathan, would you care to react to that based on your questions and what just Jennifer mentioned?
Well, maybe not right now. No, I'm happy to, but it didn't directly touch upon what I was talking about. I think Jennifer handled the answer very well.
Okay. So. Okay. And Jeremy, would you wish to add anything on that?
No, not on that particular topic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And before we continue with the questions, I'd probably like to mention the web color of my camera setting. It's a technical fault with my laptop camera, so nothing to do with the GGKP platform. So apologies to webinar participants for that particular weird color I was saying. So thanks, Jennifer, for that very interesting further explanation. You've been talking, Jonathan, about particular challenges in developing countries and the links to innovation for the private sector, but also some of the barriers that some of them might be facing. As well as some of the benefits some of them might be getting from engaging in voluntary markets, such as multiple development benefits. You mentioned, you took the example of cook stoves and the use of pellets instead of wood and health benefits. So that's very closely linked to the consumer base. But consumer is not one particular group, it's a diverse group. How would you look at various stakeholders working together to build consumer demand for renewables? How would you see the various drivers for different categories of consumers based from the work you're doing at the World Bank?
Well, that's a great question, the million-dollar question or the billion-dollar question. A lot of what the World Bank does is through the traditional utilities that may have undergone some form of restructuring, generally less than the OECD countries, building a transmission line, building a centralized power plant. Really don't do fossil fuels in that area anymore. Helping them improve the efficiency of their T&D system, stuff like that. So I don't want to give the impression the World Bank is all about, next generation cook stoves, but there is a fair amount of work there on the off-grid space as well. So looking at cook stoves, how do you drive demand there? It's really tricky to do, and originally the impulse of bureaucracies, including my organization, is to take the best, get some really good technology and just drop it in there, and everything will take care of itself. That was very much the approach with cook stoves, and then you had sort of over-engineered, way overpriced products going into the market, which were more supply-driven than demand-driven. You saw that to a certain extent, maybe a little bit less with the solar off-grid market as well. And it kind of, the reason you had these problems kind of prompted my second point, is how do you ensure you get the local private sector involved, and why we think right now the results-based financing is the best way to stimulate demand, because the demand has to come from consumers. Just as you sell anything in any country, the consumer has to want it. Now, you subsidize or incentivize, certainly incentivize is the more politically correct term, that choice in a way that has non-market benefits of climate change with renewable energy, and then health benefits with reduced emissions in the case of the stoves, not to mention gender equity issues and a whole range of them. So it's a really, really tricky question. That we continue to try to come up with an answer. How do you get the demand properly stimulated? Because it has to be demand from consumers, as any retail transaction has, but in the absence of interventions, you won't get it going in the direction that you want. Just one more thing, Jennifer, you raised a good point, kind of throwing a bit more water on my rather sober outlook to begin with, that, can we apply this to off-grid markets, and there's challenges there. Another thing we're doing in the World Bank is more on the supply side, but is certification of renewable suppliers, so that you don't get a sort of a wild west there with a lot of very bad quality merchandise, which just kills the reputation in the market. And that's really important. It's more on the supply side, but it won't stimulate your demand so much as it will not kill your demand, as you would the case if you get very poor products out in the market. So it's a really tricky question, and one that we spend a lot of time thinking about, to be honest.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring up about certification. We've found that in the voluntary renewable energy markets that my presentation was focused on, that certification has been a really key tool to getting markets going, because one, consumers don't know what it is that you're talking about, and so having a trusted third party vouching for it makes a big difference. And also, you don't want to have the situation when you're in the early stages of developing a new market or technology where something bad happens, and then that's what everyone remembers. And so by having third-party certification and verification, you can help bolster the market and make sure that the products out there are credible, so that consumer confidence grows over time.
Yep.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jonathan. That also triggers the question of guarantee of origin. I mean, you talk of certification and verification. For the benefit of the audience today, would you be able to give us a few examples of experience in the US and how the verification and certification scheme has been evolving with the growth of the renewable energy market, the voluntary market, to avoid double accounting, which is also an important point you mentioned during your presentation?
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of parallels between how the market developed in the United States and also in Europe, with regard to both the aspects of your question about certification and verification, and also with double counting. And so if you look in Europe with the GEO market, which GEOs underscore all the voluntary renewable energy products that are offered in Europe. Some companies buy GEOs on their own, and then many energy providers offer renewable energy products that have GEOs backing them up, so that there's no double counting. There are a number of different organizations, NGOs, verification in different countries across Europe. Sometimes the certification program, the standard behind it, will have an emphasis on a certain type of technology or certain types of sustainability goals, but they've been very important in providing consumer confidence to buyers in different European countries who are interested in participating in the voluntary market. In the United States, we've got a little bit different market structure. Instead of countries, we have a bunch of states. Here, there's been really only one main certifier in the voluntary market, and that's been the Greenie program, which is administered by the Center for Resource Solutions, and its standards overseen by an independent governance board. Here, the Greenie program started in the very early days of the voluntary market, mainly out of concern for consumer protection. And so during the first days of deregulation, when marketers started popping up offering green power to customers, the question on everybody's mind was, well, how do you know they're actually delivering the benefits they promised? And how can we make sure that we don't have a big flop in the market where one of these sellers is shown to be basically taking people's money and not delivering the benefits that people thought that they were getting when they pay for it? And so the certification program began with that main purpose, which was to create standards for what constitutes green power, and then to audit the companies selling it to make sure they were actually buying and delivering renewable energy, and also to look at a point that Jeremy brought up earlier, is communications. So a very important part of developing these markets is to have clear communications with customers. And so if you look now at the well-developed markets, both in Europe and in the United States, there are now legal requirements in place for power providers to give customers information about the type of energy they're receiving. This is a very important tool, one, for increasing customer knowledge about electricity markets and what's really behind when you turn on your light, what's behind it. And also so customers can have a better appreciation of the mix of resources that's on the grid. And that way when they get an offer for a different resource mix from another provider or from a utility program, they have a basis on which to compare it. So these things all work together to help strengthen voluntary markets and also increase just lay people's understanding of how the electricity markets work. If you think about, the longer term perspective about engaging consumers in green energy and other sustainable practices on a voluntary basis, increasing consumer education on these sectors is a critical component of that. People aren't going to understand the impact they can have by choosing a more efficient cook stove or switching their power provider unless you do, build up this level of education and understanding over time and over generations even.
Absolutely, Jennifer. Communications is increasingly becoming a key part of most transformational changes and recognized as probably one of the most important upfront preparatory elements before programs are rolled out or during their implementation. From what you've been talking about, all three of you, Jennifer, Jonathan, and Jeremy, we see a relationship between the producers, the purchasers, project pipelines, and consumers. So, in a way, those stakeholders exist depending on circumstances, probably within states. In the US, the market structure differs between states. In Europe, across countries, there's increasing interconnection. So how would you see the ability of markets to have consistency when those markets are transboundary in nature, and of having agreed exchange rates between those markets? And what has been happening over time, how do you see this evolving in the near and medium-term future?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. So people are, I think, used to thinking about carbon markets, which are global markets that don't have boundaries. When you talk about renewable energy markets, there are boundaries inherent in these markets, and those are pretty much, the extent of the grid and the regulatory structures that oversee the grid. And so one question that often comes up is there a way to develop a single currency for trading renewable energy across boundaries so that they, someone in an industrialized economy could help support renewable energy in a developing country? And there are many ways of doing that. Customer choice for using renewable energy is probably not one of them. And the reason is that when consumers and businesses want to make a credible claim that they're using renewable energy and they're doing this for greenhouse gas accounting, or there's a whole number of other types of certifications, green building certifications and others that are global that look at renewable energy use in buildings or for processes, they all require that the renewable energy basically be delivered to the customer or to the grid on which the customer is interconnected. And so these markets are essentially regional markets. They can be multi-country markets, like in the European situation, where there's a lot of electricity trading and sort of regulatory consistency across markets. The United States, in most cases, a single country could be a market, but trading, generating renewable energy in, say, India and saying that you're using it in Sweden just doesn't meet the criteria that most purchasers need, and that there's been a lot of guidance put out by different organizations for carbon accounting and other purposes that those kinds of transactions won't fulfill.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, let me just chime in. I would agree with Jennifer. It's really, really ambitious to try and do that. Tough enough even through the use of more prescriptive regulatory tools to drive renewables deployment. I remember about 4 or 5 years ago, the World Bank helped Morocco build a large solar plant. They got a lot of sun down there with the plan to export the power to Spain, where at that time they had extremely high renewable energy tariffs, feed-in tariffs, renewable energy feed-in tariffs for solar, like 35 cents or so per kilowatt hour. And then various things happened, including the decrease in the strength of the Spanish economy, the European economy in general. The whole thing stopped. So that was in a really regulatory market, a heavily regulated market with a lot of political will behind it, and it still couldn't happen because things happen. And then to take that in a voluntary market where there's even more uncertainty, it might be tough. That said, what do you do to, going back to my point of how do you encourage business to get in here? How do you create a market that's attractive to them? And a market that's attractive to them is not one country, unless maybe it's the US. Or even Germany or Japan. Well, Germany, you would be across Europe, but the smaller African countries, and they are smaller, certainly in terms of economy. It's not a very attractive market. So you have to think of tools to get these private sector players to get in there, see an attractive market, and that definitely involves, at least in a long-term, medium or long-term strategy, more than one country. So you want to have something that helps them to get across one country to the next.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about demand drivers, one thing that we've found has been really effective recently is some NGO efforts to gather together purchasers and have them put their demand together and communicate it effectively. So RE100 is a great group right now that's working with a lot of the largest companies around the world to help them one, make commitments to use renewable energy across all their operations, and then beginning to think about how they can communicate to governments where these companies have load, and they might not be in the smallest of the sub-Saharan African countries in quantity, but they are in significant quantity in a lot of sort of emerging developing economies, and can be a significant driver. They can bring capital to the table. They're credit-worthy partners, for the finance industry, and can help get projects built that wouldn't otherwise be able to be put on the ground.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. What you said, Jonathan, is very valid. I mean, we've seen regional strategies, regional targets appearing. If we take Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, for example, in the SADC or COMESA or the ECOWAS region on bioenergy, on fuel economy for vehicles. So I think this is a very interesting idea, that this is yet another sector where probably not harmonization, but a regional approach to increase the market share could drive the market further and faster, and create a framework that will be more interesting for capital and for investment to happen. Jeremy, I would have maybe a question for you. You've talked about data and analytics. You did mention that you have more experience in the US, but for your own work, how do you see the data challenge in developing countries and emerging economies as a barrier to the growth of voluntary markets?
Yes, I think data availability is generally very challenging in developing countries. Obviously, as Jonathan said, that's a very broad designation. It's less challenging in some than others. I think that on the highest level, I think that it's difficult sometimes to understand the shape of a renewable energy market in some developing countries. So while you can access more high-level numbers on renewables as a percentage of electricity generation, it's difficult to drill down into those numbers, into different segments of renewable energy, and then within a segment like solar, looking at distributed solar, even looking geographically within national borders at sort of how distributed solar is being installed. So what that does is that it just limits the ability to, in a more nuanced way, understand the dynamics of renewable energy growth and utilization in many developing countries. And I think it's difficult because there are so many capacity limitations in terms of reporting and many different priorities that often supersede data collection. I think that's changing a little bit. I think that throughout the world now, data is becoming much more mainstreamed as a really important factor that governments, often with the support of NGOs, are developing. But that's only starting, I think, in the past few years. So as that hopefully becomes more mainstreamed, it will become more of a priority in all countries.
Thank you, Jeremy. I have one last question, and I would probably like to ask that to Jonathan, given your focus on the private sector and their role in that particular market segment. How would you see the international community better provide access to funding mechanisms that could support private sector investment more effectively into voluntary markets? What would be the drivers and the policies and the barriers that would need to be addressed as a matter of priority? Maybe picking the three most important ones to make that happen, and bearing in mind that private sector is also a very diverse group comprising large multinationals, but also smaller companies that operate within country or state level.
Well, I'm happy to give a shot at that. You're putting me a little bit on the spot here. Three top things. One thing I mentioned before is as much certainty as possible, which is a bit of a cop-out answer because, as you know, Jennifer's pointed out, and I pointed out as well, the whole point is there's less certainty. What can be done to nonetheless give comfort to financing sources, funding sources, that they want to put it into private sector to meet this demand? And in the absence of, you know, the more prescriptive regulatory interventions such as quotas or feed-in tariffs or designated renewable PPAs, some sort of demand allocation is very interesting. What Jennifer mentioned, I don't know much about that, but I know I've heard of it. But then you need to backstop that as well. You know, just saying, having a bunch of people say, yeah, I'll agree with this NGO to buy whatever. That's, you know, to backstop that with financing. Another thing to keep in mind is that we're all very greedy here, in the sense that we want change now, and with good reason, given the exigencies of the climate change threat all over the world. But you know, these markets are growing at historically fast rates. You know, I was looking at just the graphs that Jennifer showed, but we've all seen similar ones. So it takes a while for everyone to get on board with the fact that this is the new normal, we think, and that everyone certainly includes financing sources are always going to be much more comfortable with what they've seen funded before, what they've funded before, what their community of financing sources have funded before. It's very much a herd mentality with conservative bankers. So I think over time this will naturally come about. Yeah, so that's yes for three. I have two things there as best I can come up with, but that's, yeah.
Thank you. Jennifer, would you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I'd just add, you know, I think we're wrapping up on time here, that I think a lot of the issues that Jonathan brought up and also Jeremy are very important for growing markets, especially in developing country economies where voluntary markets really haven't started at all. That there's a lot of issues around financing, education, data that are all needed, not just to get companies to come in and buy renewables, but also just to get the development community in general confidence about building renewables in that market for any purpose, even for government programs. And our view is that the voluntary market, getting individuals and companies to help grow renewables, is best done in complement with policy and government interaction in the electricity sector. That those two things acting together will create a bigger pie than either one acting alone.
Very, very true. I think we're reaching almost the end of the webinar. I'd like to ask Jeremy whether he has any final remarks he'd like to share with us.
I think the one final remark that came to mind is regarding the developing world. Just has to do with, I think voluntary markets are a real opportunity for market testing in really creative ways. And again, I'm not as familiar with the mechanics of how that would work, but I think, being able to go into a region or a state or even a community and to demonstrate some level of demand on the commercial level, on the residential level, and bring that back to project developers or policymakers. I think there's something really powerful in that. And I think back to your question about data gaps and data sort of availability in the developing world, I mean, a lot of these initiatives can then filter upwards and sort of empower non-governmental entities to often that are from other countries to go in to get the data themselves and to help it be organized and synthesized and utilized by the private sector, investors, etc. So I just, to me, I see it as a very long time horizon for sure for the developing world with voluntary markets, but also one that can be activated and explored in interesting ways through a lot of the work that Jennifer's organization has done.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. We'd like to thank very much the three speakers today, Jennifer Martin, Jonathan Cooney, and Jeremy Tamanini, for very exciting perspectives on this emerging topic, which we are all confident will be growing over the coming years, very much in line to the growth we've seen over the recent years in the US, in Europe, but picking up in emerging economies, and hopefully we hope in other developing countries. So thank you very much, and back to the webinar organizers to close the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.